I always like to point out that after she married Franklin in 1906, she spent for the next 10 years, she was pregnant 6 times. And she was moving this family with the nannies and the housekeepers and her mother-in-law from New York City to Hyde Park to their summer home in Campobello, then to Washington, D.C., then back to Hyde Park. I think Eleanor gained her enormous organizational skills and her management skills managing this family. All the money. There's not enough money to pay me to do that. But in 1924, she was then asked to chair the Women's Platform Committee of the DNC, the first time the Democratic National Committee had such a group. And one of their elements in their platform was that they believed in the right to organize and join trade unions. She then went to the Democratic National Convention, where she took the platform resolutions, and she brought women from all over the country, and they met in Madison Square Garden to come up with this platform, and it was widely heralded in the New York Times. She got to the convention. She was told to sit outside the door. It was sweltering heat. It was 1 o'clock in the morning, where the men inside debated the platform that the women had produced. It was a lesson that Eleanor Roosevelt long remembered, and she would not sit outside the door again. At the same time, she walked her first picket line with the box makers in New York City in 1926. And she began to learn from the garment trades that progressive unions could be part of the solution, not only to problems of poor wages and terrible working conditions, but they were part of the solution to housing, health care, financial aid, and cultural life. The International Lady Garment Workers Union and the Amalgamated Clothing Workers had medical services, the Amalgamated had a bank, and they had incredible cultural programs. And so they've sort of brought in, it was a whole new view compared to the more conservative AFL craft unions that she had worked with before. She began to write campaign pamphlets, and they started the Women's Democratic News. Eventually, she and her friends developed one-page rainbow flyers to address women's issues, and the women became known as grass trampers, who went out all across the country to campaign and to organize for Democrats. She also worked on something called the Bach Peace Prize, which was coming out of Wilson's League of Nations to try and develop a system, an organization that would work for peace. And that was when J. Edgar Hoover set up the first FBI file on Eleanor Roosevelt, 1924. She has one of the most extensive FBI files ever. And again, you can go online and take a look at it. And there are little handwritten notes from J. Edgar Hoover. He really didn't like her. But with all the effort he put into it, he really couldn't ever do anything to stop her. And a whole lot of it's redacted even today. There are these big black lines through it. And a lot of it had to do with her civil rights work later on in the 30s and 40s with her efforts on behalf of African Americans. Interestingly, and this was a real surprise to me, when FDR ran for governor, the unions weren't much involved. In 1932, he had very little labor support. But what was surprising to me was that the official position of the AFL, the American Federation of Labor, was not to endorse in presidential races. Conservative labor leaders were quite skeptical about having the government involved in any way in their organizing or in their rights, in their negotiating with employers, even though their membership had dropped in half as the Great Depression really got underway. John L. Lewis endorsed Herbert Hoover. Big Bill Hutchinson of the Carpenters was chair of the Republican Labor Committee, and the needle trades backed socialist Norman Thomas. So there was not much left for FDR. Rose Schneiderman, however, broke ranks, and for the first time as president of the Women's Trade Union League, she endorsed FDR. And Sidney Hillman of the Amalgamated Clothing Workers had challenged the AFL and set up a separate union to challenge their garment workers union. And he became part of FDR's brain trust. We go into the New Deal without a great deal of labor support. But the New Deal becomes incredibly good for unions. And as the unions begin to grow under the National Industrial Relations Act, Eleanor's work with unions broadens from the garment workers to include miners, steel workers, electrical workers, porters, migrant farm workers, and teachers. John L. Lewis and Dubinsky and Hillman begin to organize. And by 1935, when FDR is getting ready to run for another term, the union set up what is one of the first political action committees. They established Labor's Nonpartisan League, and the United Mine Workers puts in $500,000. Almost all of it went to FDR's campaign. And $500,000 in 1936 was an extraordinary amount of money to go into a political campaign. And Dubinsky and Hillman left the Socialist Party, and they joined the Democratic Party, and they set up a Labor Party in New York, which is as close to a third party as we've ever gotten in this country. But they set up a third party in New York because they wanted to be able to show Labor's vote and to show Labor's clout within. So this political, you know, Roosevelt's and the unions, the progressive unions, are now solidly together in a political movement. And Eleanor Roosevelt was very involved in all of this. And the cover on the book is 1935, and she's going down into a coal mine. Again, totally unprecedented that a woman would go into a coal mine. A couple months later, she is in her pearls, and she is in the United Mine Workers Journal writing an article for the mine workers' wives and how they were key to combating the company stores and their obligation to get out and vote. And she never forgot the wives, just as she never forgot the rank-and-file mine workers, even when she came to disagreement with John L. Lewis. But by 1940, Eleanor Roosevelt sees labor unions as exemplifying fundamental democracy. A voice at work is just a precursor to having a voice in a political campaign, to having a voice in elections. She tells striking members of the International Brotherhood of Electrical Workers she believes everyone who is a worker should join a union. And under the New Deal, labor grew from 3 to 8 million members, went from 10 to 23% of the workforce in that decade. It was just an incredible surge. On politics, Roosevelt decides to run for a third term. John L. Lewis is an isolationist to his core, wants nothing to do with the World War in Europe, and he endorses Wendell Willkie. And he says that the workers will follow him, and if they don't, he'll resign from the CIO. And guess what? The workers did not follow him. Dubinsky and others were terribly concerned about what was going on in Europe, encouraging FDR to do more. FDR wins, and Sidney Hillman makes sure that John Lewis resigns from the CIO. As the labor movement grows in strength and power during the war, and there's lots of reasons that happens, Eleanor defends the right to strike during wartime. She works closely with A. Philip Randolph to end racial discrimination in government contracting with the Brotherhood of Sleeping Car Porters. Sidney Hillman took a leave of absence to work in the Roosevelt administration, and she also argued forcefully against what she saw as unnecessary strikes by leaders like John L. Lewis. It was during the war that she developed her closest friendship in the labor movement, and that was with the visionary young leader of the United Automobile Workers. Eleanor Roosevelt and Walter Reuther become good friends, and Walter Reuther is the age of her oldest son, and he literally becomes like another son. Eleanor did adopt a lot of people into her family, but the Reuthers, Walter and May Reuther, were the last people to visit Eleanor Roosevelt at her home in Valkill before she died in 1962. And Walter Reuther was on his way in a taxi on his way to the White House when the radio announcer announced that Franklin Roosevelt had died. And he was on his way to meet with Eleanor about some issues.